Okay, we are back with James Vaughn of the Platypus Affiliated Society and Tony from One Dime to have a kind of uh, feedback session on our original chat with James. So, if you didn't see the first one, James Vaughn is a historian of the British Empire and the Atlantic world in the 18th century. He's an instructional professor in the College of Affiliate Faculty in the History Department at the University of Chicago, the author of The Politics of Empire at the Accession of George III, and founding member of the Platypus Affiliated Society. We're very excited to have James back to chat with Tony about the American Revolution and U.S. democracy in general. And Tony is a YouTuber named One Dime. That's his channel. I discovered this channel a couple years ago. I fell in love with the channel. I thought it was great, excellent content, especially because he was making content on Marxist topics, leftist topics, but he was also incorporating things like MMT and even CASP, which is capital as power, which is a very kind of niche economic theory that not a lot of people have heard of. But yeah, I thought it was really cool that Tony was getting into all these topics and doing deep dives and well-researched videos, very slick videos too. Um, and today we have them together because last time during our conversation with James about the revolution, one of the videos last minute we were going to review was Tony's video on the separation of powers in American democracy. And we didn't end up getting time to really cover that, but our discussion vaguely went over that topic anyway. And Tony had a chance to see the original chat I had with him, and he definitely had some questions and a few critiques of his own. And so I thought that'd be a great opportunity for us to kind of have a discussion. It's not going to be a debate today. It'll be a maybe an oppositional dialogue or a friendly discussion on the topic of the American Revolution and American democracy in general as it relates to Marxism. And I just want to mention that one of the reasons this topic is important to me because I'm actually half American. My mom was American, born in Chicago, half my family's there. And secondly, because I was initially, for a long time, fully on, I think, Tony's side of the argument, a little bit more critical of the American Revolution and American democracy now. As I 2 or 3 years ago, I started to get warm up to it a little bit more and eventually stumbled upon the Platypus series on the American Revolution and kind of was ended up being fully won over to James's side. But Tony has, he shared with me some of his critiques, and so I think this will be very interesting dialogue. So I will throw it over to Tony. Maybe you can comment on the introduction of you and whether or not you wanted to add anything to that, but you can start us off.
Sure. Yeah, I guess anything to add to my description. I'm not nearly as well qualified as James is here, but my master's specialization was in U.S. democracy. It's what my dissertation was on, and it's sort of a big it's a big focus of mine. I particularly tend to specialize in the theories of Sheldon Wolin, who is a theorist, American theorist of democracy in general. I don't subscribe to all his views, but he's greatly influenced the way I think, along with Marxist critiques of democracy, but also renewing how we understand democracy, not in a binary between autocracy, democracy, etc. I don't know, in terms of the YouTube videos, people watching this will probably already know the videos, but publication I recently was on Theory Underground with that publication on the Cultural Revolution and the lessons of it. And I also published for Cosmonaut recently article on Nikos Poulantzas and why the ruling class need not rule. So that's, I guess, to give maybe before I'll say like my critique of what I thought James was trying to do. Actually, wasn't so much what he was saying, what you were saying, James. It was really more the way you were framing the arguments and what I think you were trying to do, and what I also broadly I would say a lot of people at Platypus are trying to do with regards to American history. I'll give my perspective first. So I would like to just clarify at first that I actually am very sympathetic to the view of we need to not dismiss bourgeois revolutions, not the American Revolution, not the French Revolution. We need to actually view Marxism, and of course, Marx, Engels themselves saw what they were doing as extensions of the Enlightenment and trying to theorize what promises of emancipation were not able to be fulfilled. Kind of, this is obvious to people familiar with the classical Marxist text, right? As you've pointed out in the talk I listened to with Amen here. But the main thing that I think I would disagree with, or actually before I before I'll get into that. So I do think that this is obvious in terms of that Marxism is an Enlightenment project, and that it's not dismissive of bourgeois revolutions, but it's trying to go beyond. However, and this might seem like a banal point, but it's not, and I'm sure you know, given that all the leftists today tend to have this view that will dismiss America as a settler colonial project and kind of leave people, which it is, but they the way they do it's very one-dimensionally. They tend to leave no room for American socialism or America as a what was, and they neglect what was emancipatory about the American Revolution. I tend to agree. I tend to be sympathetic even to liberals like Gordon Wood, who I think romanticize how radical the American Revolution was, but I was somewhat influenced by him a while. I was more dismissive. However, so maybe we'll get to my critiques here. I just want to say the Marxist Leninists, the Stalinists online, they tend to call me a liberal just for being believing that socialism must extend or preserve to an extent bourgeois freedoms and constitutional rights and stuff like that. So I think it is important, like, to clarify these positions, just because I don't want to say, oh, my critique isn't a sort of a complete dismissal of the American Revolution. However, I think a lot of my critiques of the American Revolution will be stuff you would already probably agree with, in the sense that, I mean, ultimately it is. Oh, well, I'm not sure if you agree with, actually, because in the talk you did, you said the idea that the framers of the U.S. Constitution were designing the Constitution for a propertied majority. You were saying that's not really true. They were designing for the rights of all people, and it wasn't a fulfillment. It wasn't a betrayal of the American Revolution, like people more sympathetic to the anti-federalists would claim, but it was a fulfillment of it. I would agree with you that it's a fulfillment of the American Revolution, but it very much is a propertied minority. And even though that it's not necessarily bourgeois revolution, I mean revolution for the rich bourgeoisie, but property owners, right? Like, that includes yeoman farmers, and but it's still, we have to keep that in mind, what that is for, because I think if we over romanticize the American Revolution and the intentions of not just the founders but the framers of the U.S. Constitution, we might legitimize, and that's what I thought was the one critique I had of the talk. I felt like you were almost, in trying to kind of defend the legacy of the American Revolution and why Marxist leftists shouldn't be dismissive of it, I felt in certain things when you were saying it's not a constitution for the propertied minority, it's for the rights of all. Various examples I could point to, but I felt it was almost reifying those institutions, which, of course, one isn't to dismiss American democracy entirely. However, I would find it hard to believe that you would deny that the institutions of American democracy, like the Supreme Court, like the Senate, like the Electoral College, like the U.S. Constitution, are designed in such a way to make, in a politics spearheaded by the propertyless majority, the proletariat, pretty much impossible, at least within those institutions. Outside of those institutions is another story. Now, at the very end of the talk, you reiterated a Marxist perspective that you support, like things like the dictatorship of the proletariat. I don't quite understand. This is my question to you. If we are trying to go beyond bourgeois democracy and establish some kind of socialist democracy and economic democracy for the proletariat, aka what the transition stage of the dictatorship of the proletariat, shouldn't the goal be to delegitimize the institutions that one is operating against as opposed to reifying them? Because there hasn't been any revolution that is successful in liberal democracies, and I think there's many reasons for that, very complicated reasons. But I mean, legitimacy, I mean that in a serious the legal sense, people will never respect any kind of revolutionary endeavor so long as there's that legitimacy of those institutions. And I think there's a correct, this is what I tried to do with my stuff a little bit, is to say, well, there's aspects of in those institutions which are built to be undemocratic in terms of in undemocratic in the sense that they exclude they very much do try to override the will of the propertyless majority. And people remember when Bernie Sanders, like social democrat, was running, everyone was saying, who are liberals or skeptical leftists, were saying he wouldn't be able to get anything done. I think they were right. They're right. Now, how would a Marxist get anything done? Assuming they were somehow elected, or even if, if they weren't elected, there's other means by which they attain political power. How does that socialist transition happen without delegitimizing things like the Supreme Court, things like the Senate, right? I think I focus on, there's all sort of structures one could point to, the Constitution itself, but I think the Supreme Court and Senate are specifically very undemocratic obstacles I like to look at because in upholding the U.S. Constitution. But yeah, I'll leave you with that. I don't want to go on too long.
Well, thank you for that, Tony, and thank you and Eamon for thanks to Eamon for hosting this dialogue and Tony to having it with me. I think what I'm hearing you say, Tony, and you correct me if I'm wrong on this, is that while you're sympathetic to many of the criticisms I have as a Marxist of the progressive perspective on the American Revolution and the US Constitution, that you worry, and this is what I take you to mean by reifying, you worry that I actually wind up basically becoming or advancing a conservative position, right? That is to say that the American Revolution and the US Constitution are the fundamental basis of all political legitimacy, and any opposition to them is wrongheaded or impossible, right? And I'm not, I don't, that isn't my view, but I try and listen to you as sympathetically as I can, because in the previous conversation with Eamon, I was focused so much on countering the progressive view that it's fair to say that in not addressing the conservative view, that I may have left the impression that I agree with the conservative view, or that conservatives and Marxists agree on the American Revolution, the US Constitution. I would say this in response to that. I think that the Marxist view is equally opposed to both the progressive and the conservative interpretation, or rather it says to both of them neither and both. And let me just say what I mean by that briefly. The conservatives, by progressive, I basically mean, progressives, liberals, supporters of the Democratic Party in the United States, Liberal Party in Canada, etc., and the socialists and Marxists who tail after them, DSA, Jacobin, etc. And by conservatives, I mean, sort of in the US context, Republicans, center-right parties elsewhere. I mean, my main difference with conservatives who share some of the ideas that I have about the American Revolution, the US Constitution, is essentially historical. That is history, meaning the 19th century happened. And so their views, I think, have been rendered effectively ideological, meaning their views on the American Revolution and the US Constitution have basically been rendered obsolescent and ideological in the course of history, in the development of the 19th century. And if I can just expand on that a bit, what I mean to suggest is this. When I'm speaking about the American Revolution, the US Constitution, I try and talk about it in two different registers. One if somebody is asking me, what did it mean at its time? I try and think, right, historically, what did it mean in the context of the 18th century, the later 18th century, in which I think it is a fundamental, both the American Revolution as an event and the US Constitution as a document are fundamentally socially and politically emancipatory. But that's because the 18th century, to my mind, is still in the period of the unfolding of bourgeois society, of bourgeois emancipation, right? Where the new world is still marching against the old world, right? And the new world is still, sending, if you will, overcoming the old world. And I think the American Revolution as a political transformation and the US Constitution is the kind of document that is the culmination, the seal of that political transformation, are ultimately works of social and political emancipation because they further the development of bourgeois revolution. They further the development of bourgeois society. They further the development of the new world and all its potentials and possibilities against the old world. However, as a Marxist, I do recognize that bourgeois society developed into the fully developed capitalist mode of production in the 19th century and came into contradiction with itself and crisis, and therefore was no longer emancipatory in any simplistic or straightforward sense, but was simultaneously a form of emancipation and a form of domination. Meaning, I take it that since more or less the Industrial Revolution or the first fully industrialized societies emerged in Western Europe in the 19th century, that bourgeois society is simultaneously a society of emancipation and of domination. And I can say more about that later. I don't want to go on too long now. But my problem with conservatives is they refuse to recognize the course of history. The fact that the 19th century happened, the bourgeois society underwent the Industrial Revolution and developed into what Marx and Engels called the capitalist mode of production. The capitalist mode of production is a form of social domination. It's a form of society that it's a social order in which we generate our own ongoing domination of ourselves that is not possible to escape within bourgeois liberal forms, but rather I believe requires an organized socialist workers movement led by a Socialist Party and ultimately the constitution of the dictatorship of the proletariat to deal with issues that are raised by the capitalist state, by bodies of armed men, and to begin a transition away from capitalism towards communism, towards a classless society. Now, that all being said, that's where I part ways with conservatives. I would say that if you, the other register I talk in, Tony, is today, meaning, of course, I am happy to talk about the way in which any organized socialist workers movement and Socialist Party leading it would have to confront the US constitutional order. There's no question that would have to happen, right? There would have to be a confrontation with it to some degree. My argument would be, or what I would say at that register is, we're not there yet. We're not even close to there yet. I mean, we're not even, I'm sorry to be really crude about this, close to there, to close to there, to close to there, to close to there, to close to there yet, right? We're very, very, very far away from there. We don't even begin to know how an organized socialist workers movement, a mass-based Socialist Party, would have to deal with the political orders presently constituted in the US, eventually with the constitutional order itself, right? The whole system of the federal republic, 50 states, the high, as you said in your video, which I watched, right? The high degree of decentralization, all of that will have to be dealt with. So I want to be clear that it's not that I think that what was achieved in 1788 with the ratification of the US Constitution was some final political order that will not have to be transformed and changed. It's not that I don't think an organized socialist workers movement and a mass Socialist Party will have to eventually confront the present political order in the US and the way it's shaped by the federal Constitution. But I don't think we're there yet. And my concern about people, and here I'm focusing more on the kind of video that Eamon and I discussed in our last conversation, That video put out by the Canadian branch of the IMT Fight Back, and put out generally by progressives and the DSA and Jacobin and all these other organizations, they talk about all of these impediments that the federal constitution, that the constitutional order has to socialist politics. What they really mean by that, okay, and I'm going to be brutal here, but I think it's true, is they mean the impediments to the Democratic Party enacting the policies they currently want to enact. DSA and Jacobin are not the organizers of a mass socialist movement. They are the court whisperers to policymakers of the Democratic Party. And the reason why they developed this whole narrative of critiquing the separation of powers, checks and balances, all of that is not because they're in a lively, robust socialist party that is part of a wider organized socialist workers movement in civil society that is seeking to change an order that is basically limiting or constraining it. They're not doing that at all. As far as I can tell, they don't have any interest in it. But that being said, what they are really doing, what Bhaskar Sunkara and what Jacobin and the whole DSA apparatus is really about doing, is basically being court whisperers to policymakers of the Democratic Party. We want you to pursue these Keynesian stimulus projects. We want you to pursue these progressive bureaucratic reforms. And the thing that stands in the way of this are things like the Electoral College and the Senate and the failure to have a direct Democratic vote as opposed to an indirect vote. I mean, that's really while they're emphasizing all these things. So, Tony, I don't have any problem having a conversation about how the present political order in the US and indeed the Constitution itself will have to be confronted and changed. I just think we have to think about the historical context we're in. And the historical context we're in, that simply isn't a question anywhere near being on the table, because we haven't even figured out how to renew an organized socialist workers movement and build a mass-based socialist party. And so what I'm trying to point out when I criticize the progressive views is what the progressives are really talking about when they lay out this whole critique of the US constitutional order is they're saying, how do we get the Democratic Party to be able to enact the things it wants to enact? That's what they want. They want capitalist, statist reforms from the top down. That's what they aim at. And the final thing I will say in response to you, Tony, is if you think about those two different registers, that is one, thinking about historically the American Revolution and the US Constitution in its late 18th century moment, as opposed to register two, which is about our contemporary political world. And I'm happy to continue to discuss either of those with you. I would just say that you're, of course, right to say that in the late 18th century, the Federalists, meaning those who were the architects and sought the ratification of the US Constitution, the Federalists did design it to preserve private property. But I think if you think of it in this late 18th century moment, right, their conception of property was effectively a Lockean conception of property, which is that property is created by human labor, by humans interacting with one another and through working together, cooperating together, transforming the world around them, adding value to the stock of existing things, and claiming private property rights in that. That is, I recognize your right to property and you mutually recognize my right to property. And in their view, I think what they were trying to do was create a world where you would have basically a limitlessly expanding market and a limitlessly extending division of labor, right, through free social and economic cooperation of self-determining individuals. And that would allow people to continue to find gainful employment, to work to save, and to accumulate property. And indeed, to come into the voting franchise by meeting the property qualification by accumulating property. So while I absolutely agree with you that they were concerned to save private property, it wasn't a pre-bourgeois, pre-modern conception of private property, i.e. the kind of private property of the British landed elite or the European land elite, where there was only so much finite property, real estate, land, territory. that it could only be divided and redivided between a landed elite, and that landed elite passed on to their family that title to property, and with it title to participate in political systems like the parliament in Great Britain. Rather, they were thinking of property as much more creative, dynamic, meritocratic, transformative, that people could freely set the course of their own lives, figure out where they wanted to live, who they wanted to work for, in the course of their daily existence, decide how they want to spend their money, to be thrifty and save, and to be able to accumulate or not. And then over time to get property, to meet the franchise to vote, and to come into political participation. Because obviously, when the Federalists are arguing, most of the states still have property qualifications. Those won't be eliminated until the early 19th century.
Jackson.
Yeah, right. So I've gone on too long, but I'll just conclude by saying, I guess I would just, where I'd not disagree with you, because I agree they're trying to protect property, as I try and encourage you to maybe think about what they mean by property in their late 18th century context, right? They do not mean private ownership of the means of production in a Marxist sense, of giant means of production, exchange, distribution being owned by very, very, very few people, right? Whether it's, industrial capitalist in Victorian Britain, or it's massive hedge funds and investment portfolios today. They meant that kind of property that was accumulated by people in the course of their own lives. And furthermore, they didn't just want to defend minority rights. I agree with you. When they talk about minority rights, they talk about property owners, right? And they do talk about creditors, because debtors would always be in the majority, obviously. But they also, and this is where I think the progressive interpretation just reads a ton of history out. They talk about religious minorities. They talk about ethnic minorities. James Madison makes a very, very strong point in the documents he writes, the speeches he gives building up towards the Annapolis Convention and then the later Philadelphia Convention, trying to have a new federal constitution. He tries to say prejudice of skin color, right? Because what we have to confront is that Democratic majorities going all the way back to Virginia in the 1660s and 70s passed race-based slavery into law, right? They did that. And they were all fully aware, all the founders knew that race-based slavery would be continuously voted by majorities, right? So they, and most of them wanted to set up the conditions to end slavery, not immediately, but gradually. Okay. So I do think you're right to say they're concerned with defending minorities, but I think their view of property is that property is infinite. It's transformative. It's something created through labor. It's something that can spread throughout society. It's not finite. It's not zero sum. Everybody throughout society can accumulate property and come into the franchise, come into the kind of whole find that the federal government gives them security for their property. And furthermore, they also thought about minorities as not just property owners or creditors. They thought about minorities as religious minorities, ethnic minorities. As Madison famously says, I think this is, and I really will conclude with this. I know I've said now 5 times I'll conclude. I really will conclude. Madison said that in some aspect of your life, and I think this applies tonight to all of us in 2023 as it does when he said it in the late 1780s, in some aspect of your life, you will be in a minority. And so be warned, if you want a majority to decide things, if you think that political liberty means a majority having the right to make the decision, be warned that in some aspect of your life, some way you live your life tonight, you're in a minority. And do you really want a majority to have a say over that aspect of your life?
Yeah, you gave me a lot to respond to there. I mean, there's just that minority alone got me on a whole tangent that almost distracted me from what I was otherwise going to ask you. But I mean, with the minority, the thing is, I think an obvious objection to that probably some people might be thinking of is, I mean, did that really work? Because I mean, did it stop the persecution of Chinese people very early in American history, or African Americans, obviously? But there's a lot of examples we could point to. But and yeah, I think that is an important point you bring up, though, about property the founders and the framers had this idea that this is like the land of opportunity, and that is part of why it was so hard to build a proletarian movement, because so many people actually were invested in that system of property. Because unlike other countries, you really could be an independent farmer. You didn't have a renter, so you didn't have a landlord exploiting you all the time. You were less likely to, compared to Germany, for example, at that same time. So that is a good point, and to bring up. But I know this is obvious, but and I know the progressives, you might think the progressives overemphasize this aspect, but all that was made possible through pretty much genocide, right? And also large degrees of chattel slavery, also helping U.S. development. But I think most importantly is the fact that you have the best agriculture you can possibly have, the greatest land for of opportunity ever in history. But it's made possible through that. Now, I know the way that progressives can frame that can make it seem like America has this irredeemable quality, so that it should just be balkanized, and that there's no room for a socialist American, so like a socialist states of the United. Yeah, they have a third worldist perspective almost. You know what I'm getting at. I get what your qualm is with people who might overemphasize certain aspects of American history, but we should absolutely, though, keep that in there. I know you want part of what it seems to be your project, as well as the Platypus Project, is trying to appeal to Americans by invoking the legacy of the American Revolution. And however, one of the easiest ways that people shut down socialism is look how many people died, right? Look how many people were killed, all the violence of socialism. And it's easy to just have, oh, it was Stalinism as a scapegoat as to why all that happened. But I don't think most people really buy that, because that's been invoked for a long time by socialists as a defense against the legacy of Marxism, that, you know, these atrocities aren't real Marxisms and so on. But I think it is an understanding that if we're going to advocate an ideology that is extremely despised in the United States of America, one has to highlight America's own, the fact that its own revolution, its own emancipatory project, which was emancipatory for a large aspect of the population, but extremely the opposite for indigenous people, and for slavery, which chattel slavery drastically not just continued, but expanded after the bourgeois revolutions, particularly of England, but in America too, right? This is one thing that I think's illuminated very well in Domenico Lazzurdo's book, Liberalism, A Counter History, which is the fact that there's this kind of paradox with the bourgeois revolutions. They're extremely emancipatory. Well, it's hard to speak vaguely about bourgeois revolutions, but let's look at English liberalism and its extension in America. There is also an extremely reactionary aspect in certain respects, with regard to slavery, and the fact that the liberalism in many ways allowed for slavery to be worse because you had more rights as a slave owner over your slaves, because they were now treated as like literal property, with that could be exchanged on a market, right? So you had a whole new level of tyranny. It's not a paradox, right? Why the Confederate states were always invoking states' rights and small government and very liberal arguments for preserving slavery against the Union. So there's all that angle, right? But what I more wanted to get to, so you were saying that yes, you have, you don't hold this conservative position. I know you don't hold a conservative position because you're with Platypus. So obviously, you don't advocate for just like legitimizing the U.S. institutions. However, what it did give off that I got the impression that throughout the broader project, what was going on was not just trying a point of historical clarification, but one of a rhetorical project, which is, how do we talk about the American Revolution in a way that will build a workers' movement and appeal to Americans? And that seems to be your main argument as to why we should frame the American Revolution in this way that more upholds its legacy. However, in doing so, yes, I have that same critique that it kind of legitimizes the institutions which would make such actualization of socialism impossible. Now you say, we're not there yet. We're not even close to there yet because we don't have a workers' movement. And now we might have a lot of agreement actually when it comes to the Democrats and Jacobin and that certain side of. I have a different angle I approach it. My ruling class need not rule article is actually directed at the democratic socialists who think that they can just, if they get campaign finance fixed, that they'll be able to institute socialism easier or stuff like that. However, I mean, you say we're not even close to there yet. However, but to even advocate a politics, people aren't stupid. People are going to see. They're going to read the Communist Manifesto. They're going to see dictatorship of the proletariat. They're going to be terrified by that. And it's easy to say, well, no, that means it means something different. It's not a typical dictator. But the people's mind are still wired to think that centralization is always bad. Decentralization is always good, regardless of its class character. And it might be far away from a standpoint in which a socialist revolutionary government, whether it's elected as Marx thought might be possible, and or a revolution, or or a democratic election which turns into a revolutionary coup of sorts. There's a million ways this could transpire. It's a very complicated question, but it's too far away. It might seem too far away for us to debate, but to even advocate for a politics whose inevitable conclusion is some sort of revolutionary politics, like Marxism, dictatorship of the proletariat, those questions are going to come up with people. And I think it's hard to advocate that kind of politics without building a strong case that these institutions are extremely undemocratic, and that by building a new system, which will inevitably require some dictatorship of the proletariat, a state of exception of some kind, how do you do that other than, I don't think it's too far away. I think right now that's questions people will ask, because that's a big reason people reject Marxism and choose reformism. We can criticize people like Bhaskar Sankara and all those people who choose a social democrat type of route and use Marxism to advocate it. But why do they choose that route? Why is that route appealing? It's because people think that the other route, dictatorship of the proletariat, will necessarily lead to tyranny. And I think, or that it's just, you can't advocate it because people believe in the legitimacy of the system, which, I mean, they have a point there in terms of practicality. So I think there is a long ways to go in terms of critiquing U.S. democracy. And I don't think you would disagree on this point. But if we are to look for a grand narrative of sorts, which I see is positioned through your talks as well as Platypus in general, which I'm not against, any political movement needs grand narratives. I just think that a grand narrative actually has to be quite critical of the American Revolution, while not dismissing its historical purpose, as you said. If we look at it historically, it was quite radical in many ways for its time, not just the bourgeois revolutions, but especially the American Revolution, right? All kind of things we can look to, which is why I even sometimes invoke that little grand narrative of my own in my own way, when I make certain exaggerations about how the American Revolution opposed the British Empire. And there's certain exaggerations, like, the idea that they opposed divine right of kings. Of course, they didn't really have divine right of kings back then. They were out of parliament, but they still had a king. And this is an American mythos that we're radical because we're a republic, and that's true. All that's true. I think we should uphold that legacy. I think that's important. But what must not get lost is the fact that for us, for any sort of left of center, not to mention Leninism, Marxism, Leninism, any kind of radical politics to be not only possible in that far future, but even to be legitimately considered, there has to be a serious case for being made as to why these institutions lack a real sense of democratic legitimacy. And people all the time, theorists will say this about countries with formal democratic systems today, like Russia, Indonesia, Turkey. Many countries have formal democratic systems, Singapore. but it's fashionable for liberal theorists to call them phantom democracies, while not batting a single eye of all the flaws with the U.S. democracy and the fact that the two-party system, there's barely any real choices there. Yeah, so another point, and this is a historical point, because the contemporary point I just made, because this is another reason I believe we cannot separate, like, looking at the American Revolution historically from contemporary evaluation of American institutions and their democratic legitimacy. And that is, the fact that America has had such a lack of a workers' movement is inseparable from its history as a unique bourgeois revolution, insofar as and thinkers like Mike Davis and Prisoners of the American Dream. I had a quote I was going to read, maybe, but if we have time. But yes, it does a great job of illuminating this argument, which is that America's unique history in the fact that its bourgeois revolution occurred where there was no more remaining feudal vestiges. There was a sense in which the democratic revolution was completed, as opposed to the revolution the bourgeois revolutions in Europe, especially Germany, France. There's this enduring sense that they just aren't completed, and that there's a legacy we still need to work towards. And that's obviously the class composition, a big part of that, because in America, the bourgeois revolution is very much dominated by its commanding heights by the bourgeoisie property owners, as opposed to in Europe, there's this weird mix, right? You all know this. I'm just saying this mainly for the audience. This sort of uneasy alliance between workers, peasants, and progressive factions of the bourgeoisie in Europe against reactionary elements of the bourgeoisie and the feudal classes who are fighting hard against any democratization. There's this battle, right? In America, there's this enduring sense that it's completed after the American Revolution. And still to this day, I think there's this sense, right? People always say there's never this question of how do we further democratize America? How do we enhance economic democracy or political democracy, not to mention economic democracy, which is part of the Marxist project, obviously. In America, what is the prevailing attitude? We need to save American democracy. That was the thing that annoyed me the most about the Trump phenomenon, is liberals treated Trump as if he was some kind of exception, undemocratic exception, some threat, existential dictatorial threat to American democracy. There's no discussion as how do we actually democratize. It was all this conservative position of how do we save it? How do we preserve it? And I think this illusion keeps the system intact. It preserves the legitimacy. And that legitimacy is very powerful, because not only would it be very hard to argue, let's say an election was rigged against socialists, it would be very hard to argue it was rigged when you have such a belief in these institutions. And even when there was questions, not even to mention how valid these questions were, the evidence about Bernie Sanders being rigged, they were dismissed before the investigation was even conducted. I mean, the way in which the media was so dismissive of any possible election meddling in Bernie Sanders' election just shows us how much there's work to be done in terms of critically looking at these institutions. And if one is to talk about revolutionary politics, I don't even think that is foreseeable. Even most people aren't even going to consider that if people still think there's this legitimate democratic road. And not only do I think that's difficult in most capitalist democracy, I think it's particularly difficult in American democracy, not just due to the electoral college and two-party system, but also due to things like the Supreme Court. In Canada, the prime minister can override the Supreme Court much more easily. And when there's a majority government in Canada, the prime minister can pretty much do whatever they want, the elected government, so long as it's within the existing charter and so long as it doesn't override the rights of the provinces, which they all have to vote if they want to change. In America, it's just even student debt getting struck down by Joe Biden's student debt reforms getting struck down by the Supreme Court. Now, it's easy to say this is all social democratic reformism, whatever. How is a radical Marxist politics even going to be conceivable? And unless those institutions are delegitimized, it might seem like I'm repeating myself, but I mean, it's not really far in the future. I mean, the regular people will ask us. They're going to say, how would you get anything done? What if the Supreme Court strikes you down? You can't just tell them, oh, we're just going to like abolish the Supreme Court and create a new court that is designed for whatever. They're going to be, what? That's dictatorship. So the only way to build that case is a delegitimization. And that's a very, not just political question, but a rhetorical strategic question.
Let me just jump in here real quick before James responds and say that after James responds, I would like to respond to a couple things that both you guys have said about how revolution happens and the dictatorship of the proletariat. So yeah, I'll just let James go.
So there's a lot to respond to there, and I apologize if I miss anything. You can tell me, Tony, if you want me to come back on anything. Few things. One, as a thing, I'm not dismissive of reformism. I don't mean to be dismissive of reformism. I just want reformism to be clear-eyed, honest about what it's doing, right? I don't want reformism to sow illusions, right? So I am in no way against reforms whatsoever. And now, on the one specific reform you mentioned, you talked about the move by the Biden administration to
relieve student debt.
Right, relieve student debt. And you had referred to this, how did you call this, a social democratic reform? Or
oh no, I said reforms.
Okay. Now,
but the social democrat would just be more radical versions of policies along such lines, right? Like healthcare, let's say universal healthcare. That could be struck down by the Supreme Court too.
I do want to say one thing, which is that because I do think this is indicative of how lowered our horizons have become. I mean, canceling student debt would, of course, just be burdening working class people. I know it doesn't seem like that. And I know probably like me, Tony, you live in professional middle class milieu or aspiring professional middle class milieu where debt burden is a thing. But all that would happen if debts were canceled in the way the Biden administration wants, right, is eventually it would burden the working class in taxes. Somebody is going to pay for those.
That's just not true, though.
Somebody is going to pay for those debts.
That's like objectively not true.
If it's not the professional middle class,
I would go hard against that one.
Okay.
I mean, like, did the working class, like, even in who paid for the Iraq wars? And Iraq war and Afghanistan,
it's not going to be in an immediate sense. I don't mean they're going to, of course I'm not, hold on.
It's a reserve currency.
Hold on. I'm not crudely saying they're going to immediately pass some kind of extremely regressive tax on working people, but it will become, I mean, the point is the money is going to come from somewhere. And
the Federal Reserve types it into existence. They literally admit that.
Yeah, of course. If the professional middle class people or the aspiring professional middle class people who accumulated those debts don't pay them, it will go into building up fiscal deficit, building up a public debt, building up taxes, which will fall on all people. Now, the wealthy can afford them. The professional middle class can afford them because they actually got something, entree into professional middle class careers from their university degree. But the people who can least afford them, working class people, weren't even given the entree into professional middle class careers. So on some level, I really want to say that, I don't think that's a very social democratic measure
I'd agree with you. It's not. But I would object pretty strongly to the paying for it rhetoric. I think that's.
Now, Tony, I want to be clear. I think that there's a complete racket around university tuition costs and all of that. I say this from somebody who teaches at a university, is a racket, meaning they just keep driving up the tuition that's irrelevant to anything they actually offer people. And the reason why they can do this and, still claim to represent broad swaths of the population is, of course, because federal and state governments give out huge amounts of loans, right? Creating the debt problem. So I'm not for any, I want to be clear, I am for the reform of that entire system, although I think the reforms have to go beyond debt cancellation. I think the reforms have to go to kind of deeper questions of public education. Okay.
Yeah, so my point is, though, is this, that if the creditors would be so against that. If the representatives of the banks would be so hostile to a meager reform like that, imagine the opposition, and imagine how much they would wield the political system against a actual social democratic reform, which realistically would be they would be one of the first agendas of a Marxist revolutionary government. I mean, in which all socialist states, what they end up doing at the start is just doing really basic stuff that has little to do with socialism, just alleviating poverty and stuff. And if such a meager reform like what we were just talking about is so difficult to implement, how else would one implement it without delegitimizing those institutions that obstruct it? That's kind of what my
No, I understand, and I may have bogged us down in this, so I'm sorry about that. So there are a lot of things you raised, and I want to go back to quite early in what you said. First off, you brought up the points about the American Revolution being based to some degree on genocide and slavery, right? I do want to respond to that. First off, what I think is really important is when we talk about the American Revolution, by which I include everything basically from the beginning of the colonial American resistance movement to the British imperial reforms at the end of the 7 Years' War, all the way up to and including the kind of ratification of the federal constitution and the launching of the new national government in the late 1780s. I broadly conceive of all of that as the American Revolution. That is not the same as the entire evolution of colonial settler society in English/British North America, meaning they're not one and the same thing. So no, I don't think the American Revolution or the U.S. Constitution are based on genocide or slavery. And let me just expand on what I mean by that. It is absolutely the case, obviously, as you said, that transatlantic slavery was a particularly brutal form of slavery. That is to say, slavery has existed since the dawn of civilization, but the kind of massive coerced migration of West African peoples across the Atlantic, and they're being reduced solely to, an implement of production, an implement of work, chattel slavery. That was, of course, a kind of new level of brutality, but that was not a product of the American Revolution. That had begun to come into existence, right, more or less in the post-Columbus Atlantic world, and really came to inform the British colonies in North America in the later 17th and early 18th century. And but it's the American Revolution that actually questions that entire system. That is to say, because of the developments of the American Revolution, because of the transformation of the belief of the free colonists that their rights were some form of historical or traditional or hereditary rights of Englishmen, but rather they came to believe that their rights were the natural rights that all people should have, or many of them came to believe that opened up the possibility of the systematic questioning of chattel slavery, of plantation slavery, of all forms of slavery in colonial North America. And it is indeed the case that in the 1760s and 70s, as the colonial American resistance movement is getting off the ground and eventually the American Revolution is unfolding, the first manumission and abolition societies are formed. And they, in quite quick order, I mean, within a matter of a couple of decades, eliminate or set on the path to elimination all forms of slavery in the northern colonies. They achieve in 1787 the guarantee that no slave labor will extend into the new territories to the west in the so-called Northwest Ordinance, the Ohio River Valley onward area. So to make a long story short, I don't believe the American Revolution is premised on slavery. I believe the American Revolution opens up the possibility of the questioning and indeed gradual abolition of slavery. Now that changes again in the 19th century for precisely the reasons that I criticize the conservatives, meaning capitalism fully develops. You have the Industrial Revolution, you have Eli Whitney's cotton gin, you have a massive demand for hand-picked cotton, and therefore what had been declining tobacco, indigo, plantation areas of the North American economy become revivified into the Cotton Kingdom, the Deep South, all of that. And whereas previously all legislation had been pursuing putting limits on slavery, meaning what's really important, I think, to understand is the American Revolution begins the process of eliminating slavery in the northern states and the process of preventing slavery's further spread beyond the southern states. Now, what begins to happen because of the Industrial Revolution and the demand for raw cotton and the development of the Cotton Kingdom is it's absolutely the case that slavery then begins to push westward, right? I won't get into it, but you have a whole series of developments following the Louisiana Purchase and then later the Missouri Crisis, Missouri Compromise of 1819, 1820, all of these things, and slavery comes back. And then it becomes clear to people, to abolitionists and radicals, and this eventually informs the founding of the Republican Party and people like Abraham Lincoln, that what the founders had done with the American Revolutionaries and the Federalists had done was to set slavery on the kind of long road to extinction, right? To kind of hem it into a few southern states where eventually those states would decide on their own to basically end bondage and to transform their societies and economies, that wasn't going to happen, that it required a kind of political confrontation. Now, on the genocide question, I think it's really crucial to recognize that, well, first off, I want to make a point because the genocide stuff is overdone. Okay, it's really overdone, meaning a lot of the elimination of Native American populations is due to obviously unintentional accidental causes, the spread of disease, right? Certainly there are border wars and all of that kind of stuff and frontier wars that are quite brutal. I don't deny that. But also there are a great deal of treaty making, meaning if you look at the formation, I'll just talk about English/British North America in the 17th and 18th century, a lot of the acquisition of land is what we would understand as pursued not through conquest, but peaceful mechanisms of trade and treaty. Now, the point needs to be made is what you're getting, Tony, is not a colonial settler project with a genocidal intent. Rather, what you're getting is a colonial settlers and indigenous societies that have completely different ideas of land use, values and norms of land use. And so it is the case when many indigenous people and formations are making diplomatic treaties or trade arrangements, they don't see this land as being sort of permanently alienated for them and becoming the absolute property of the people they're dealing with. Okay. But nevertheless, although, of course, I think that the colonial settler project is based on land acquisition, expropriation from indigenous peoples to an important degree, the idea that it's a deliberate genocide, I just think that's one of these false narratives that is developed in our history. Now, that being said, again,
is not a big part of Manifest Destiny?
Well, I promise I'll finish with this point, let you come back because obviously I have many things.
Oh, that's my only question. But, like with what you just said, that's the only thing. Yeah.
But let me just finish this one part about the genocide. I'm almost done with this. So now we go up to the American Revolution. Again, the American Revolution is not the same as the entire evolution of colonial North America, right? If, many people in the 1750s would have been happy to just remain subjects of the British Crown, denizens of the British Empire, etc. But a whole series of things happened that triggered the American Revolution, which was a radicalization of both political ideas and political practice in the 13 Eastern Seaboard colonies. In the American Revolution, actually, you begin to get people, you see people begin to talk about how it is, and particularly afterwards in George Washington's administration, George Washington, first president of the United States, and his Secretary of Defense, we used to have a more honest term, his Secretary at War, Henry Knox, had very straightforward conversations about, listen, our settlers are just putting west. And basically and they're starting to have a conversation about how would you actually try and incorporate indigenous people into developing American society. I mean, Alexander Hamilton founds a whole university designed to try and encourage the development of indigenous people towards settled commercial farming, artisanship, craftsmanship. You could accuse all of that of being ethnocentric. I'm fine with that. But it's discontinuous with what you could call anything like, or it's not anything like a genocidal intent. People like Washington, people like Knox, people like Hamilton are seriously thinking about how does the United States spread west? Because in no uncertain terms, they're going west. I'll say that. They're very clear on that from the beginning. They're going all the way to the Pacific, right? And they're going to go overseas. I mean, they have a desire to be an empire of liberties. They put it from the beginning. Okay, that's clear. But the point that they make is there's a notion that you can transform indigenous people into settled commercial farmers, artisans, craftsmen, manufacturers, etc. Now you can say that's a ethnocentric vision. It's a bourgeois vision. It's how Europe itself transformed. It's how the colonies themselves transformed, and they imagine that this will be an attractive way of life for indigenous people. Manifest destiny, or what I take you to mean when you say manifest destiny, is really an ideological product of the Jacksonian era of the early 19th century, 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, where you have a fully developed globally capitalist mode of production, right? You get the Industrial Revolution in Western Europe, you get the full development of industrial capitalist societies in places like Britain and Belgium and France, etc. And it's in that kind of global context that there is absolutely, you're right. There then becomes a kind of genocidal racialist project, meaning Alexander Hamilton, Henry Knox, George Washington, I can send you their correspondence. They absolutely think indigenous people are as capable of anyone else of being commercial settled farmers, manufacturers, artisans, and even giving rise to, basically philosophers, statesmen in, what we would describe as Western statesmen.
I'd like to see the Washington correspondence because I was aware of Hamilton believed that.
Yes, Washington and Knox have a correspondence about that, and they and Hamilton founds a college about that. I mean, they really do believe that there's that if indigenous people, right, essentially can be incorporated in developing American society and can find a place and are fully capable. Hamilton has this basic view that everybody is essentially he believes there's inequality, but he doesn't think it has to do with ethnicity or race. Right. He sort of has this view that if you have a free society,
he grew up in Jamaica, didn't he?
Right. Exactly. Born in the West Indies, right? Free society, the cream will rise to the top. He doesn't think the cream is inherently white, even though cream is white. But right, he thinks, of course, that people of African descent, that indigenous people, that people of he even will say, because people at the time thought Germans and Irish, many people thought were inferior, that people of that descent can rise to the top. Right. So he does have a view that there will be what he calls an aristocracy of merit, that if you have a free society, these highly talented people will rise to the top. And he thinks indigenous people are perfectly capable of that. Right. What I'm trying to emphasize here in this is basically to say there's a transformation in the early 19th century. The dominant U.S. political class view becomes in the age of Jackson. Right. It's Andrew Jackson's view. They're racially inferior. Right, that civilization is whiteness. White man is civilization. Redskins are essentially inherently inferior. Right, they're savage. There's a deep biological difference. They're incapable of civilization, and that they should either be pushed west or rolled over. Right, but the only thing I'm emphasizing in this is because I think that a lot of people who talk about this stuff, they conflate the history or they flatten it out. And therefore, they miss that moment, that moment of bourgeois emancipation, that takes place in this broad American revolutionary experience. And then they fail to see how that moment of bourgeois emancipation comes into crisis, comes into contradiction with itself in crisis, and ultimately, right, becomes the basis for a capitalist racialism that does develop in the period of manifest destiny. Now, there are many other things that I want to respond to in what you said, but I'll just finish this with this one point because I know Eamon wants to come in. You said to me, listen, if you talk to people about things like the dictatorship of the proletariat, I know you said a lot more than this, and I'm truncating, so you can come back. People will think this is crazy, or people will hear you talk about centralization, or I'm not sure what you meant by that, but we can talk more about that later, right? And they will become concerned about it. And what about Marxism? What about Stalinism? I get that all the time, meaning I confront that all the time, and I don't overcome it, right? But I also am having conversations with people like me, people like Eamon, people like you, right? Meaning I'm not having conversations in the context of a decades-long movement in civil society to build up a socialist workers movement and a socialist party. Of course, if you just come ready-made to people and say, I want the dictatorship I want the dictatorship of the proletariat. And what pronouns do you want to be referred to? Right? If that is how you interact with people, yeah, of course that's going to be the response. But I think I'm not saying we can replicate the Second International experience, but I think that we failed to think about how the Second International, they had decades of building up a movement in civil society, of talking to people and being talked to by people, of learning whole ways of living in civil society, independent of the capitalist parties in the States, building up a movement. They had, I mean, Tony, they had all their own little educational institutes. That's what people like Rosa Luxemburg, right? Much smarter, much more versed than any academic like me or anybody else I know, right? It's whole trained in that world. She came out of that entire world, right? I mean, I'm not saying she wasn't intellectual, but I'm saying she wasn't somebody who was just, a talker, which I am, right? Either in academe or YouTube or what have you, right? She was part of an actual, right, lived movement, transforming and being transformed by the world. And I guess I'm not prepared. Yes, if I just went up to people and started talking about dictatorship proletariat, I'm sure all the responses you would say. But I do think we have to imagine a long-term project where we're not, where we're talking to people about at the level of their bourgeois discontents, meaning you want to make a fair wage for a fair day's work. You want to be able to save up. You want to be able to improve your life. You want to be able to love who you want, assemble with who you want, say what you want, speak your mind, associate with who you want to. All these kind of fundamental bourgeois rights, right? You want to be able to decide the course of your existence. You want to figure out what you're good at, what you enjoy. You want to be able to make a living from it. You want to dispose of that living as you want to. You want to improve your condition, your family and friends' conditions. You want to assemble and associate, talk, discuss, organize with other people. I think we have to speak to people at the level of those rights and how, they're made a travesty of under capitalism. Right. And so I just don't think we're at the stage yet where we can begin on a YouTube video or in discussion with one another to have some master strategy for how we convey the dictatorship of proletariat. I think those kinds of conversations, would only come up in the context of a much longer term project of organizing in civil society.
Okay, I'll just jump in as quick as I can here. 2 points. I need to defend, I think, the IMT from James's claim about tailing Democrats, although he may not have been specifically talking about Trotsky at sex. And then offer Tony the Trotskyist take on revolution in the U.S. Because that hasn't explicitly been brought up here. But yeah, so the IMT, my former organization, they talk about the need for a clean break with the Democrats. And the first step is that an independent workers' party is what's necessary. Revolution or even reform through the Democrats or the Republicans is an impossibility because these are fundamentally bourgeois parties embedded in a bourgeois framework, fundamentally incapable of abolishing itself. So parliamentarism is not a way to get to revolution. So it has to come from without. And anyway, so yeah, that's my little quick defense of the IMT. And yeah, Tony, you said that there has to be a serious case for why democratic institutions lack legitimacy made to win over workers from the Marxists. Yeah, so the Trotskyist perspective would be that all you
that
need.
they're not democratic so that they lose legitimacy, right? Because
Right.
they have legitimacy so long as it's perceived to be marginally democratic. Not many people don't actually believe in these institutions based on voting patterns, right? The voter turnout's like 62% or something and 64% in America. But many people act as if they believe in it, and especially the political class. Given that was my biggest takeaway from the Trump experience, and that's why I take it seriously, because Trump revitalized, I think, the illusion of a democracy in the United States, because rather than undermine it, that's the paradox, because they always talk about he's undermining it. I thought more than ever I've seen people talk about our democracy. I remember like under Bush and Obama when people were like there was a kind of much more nihilistic look at this, but that's kind of what I mean by that.
Um,
I want to
yeah.
derail you.
Fair enough, but I mean, I agree that any Marxist party eventually will be making this case against why these institutions are failing. But like the main thing for a revolution or revolutionary situation is that all you really need is to have a party waiting in the wings, which James has said is way far off, and I think he's right. And that party is just going to need the right slogan, the right demands at the right moment. And that we've seen this in the past before, where the Bolsheviks were very small and had not much popularity at all, except among the most advanced workers. And then they went from that to winning over everybody within like a few months. Or not everybody, but a giant proportion of Russia. And when the status quo is crumbling, when the ruling class is completely loses legitimacy on its own through either crises or an apparent dual power situation with a strong workers movement, the masses are going to look to unconventional solutions they'd never normally consider under normal circumstances, right? Like this is what we see. I think we've seen over the past decade with these far right parties that people like Argentina, right? Like Argentina is in crises, and all of a sudden people are saying, "Fuck it, we'll vote for this weirdo." And in my estimation, it's going to go much, much worse for them, and there'll probably be another swing left right after that. But I mean, the same thing happened with Trump. People were sick of the status quo. Fuck it, we'll try this guy. Hillary, even though we don't like him, right? People would explicitly say, I don't like what he stands for, but he's something different. This is the kind of thing people will give up the specter of Stalinism in the 20th century when Marxists are organizing with the right message at the right time and the right demands. The conditions are going to be themselves what dictate this, and there just has to be a Marxist party at the right there at the right time. Because the masses will be looking for those radical ideas with clear demands and explanations, and they'll take a chance. That's all I had to say.
And explanations.
Yeah, and explanations.
All right. That's the thing I was trying to really emphasize there, is that we can't actually separate, because anyway, it seems like we're decades away from anything happening, but there's the famous quote, Lenin quote, there's weeks where decades happen and weeks where decades happen. So I don't think we can just sit around and wait for the right circumstances. And we say we need to build a party, but building a party, as you said, requires the right message or requires framing, which by and large seems to be what this discussion actually is about. It's like, how are we looking at the legacy of the American Revolution? I just want to say, James, I actually think you made a really good point of clarification about the U.S., the American Revolution not being based in genocide, but I would say American democracy, because yeah, of course, Manifest Destiny really begins in the Jacksonian period, but Jackson's also coincidentally the guy who gives suffrage to all white males who can vote without property.
That's an extremely important point.
Right.
It's underscoring, but Tony, I'm not trying to be difficult. That strikes me as more a problem for you than for me. That the guy who extended democracy so thoroughly was the guy who was most genocidal with regards to indigenous people, and that genocide, if you call it that, was driven by democracy.
Right. No, but that is, I don't know why I would say that causes a problem for me though. I'm saying that
sorry, I didn't mean
it was enabled, that radicalism, right? Which seems like a radical, it comes right into conflict with that. And you have now all of a sudden a much bigger resentment between the white population and the indigenous people, who are much more likely now to support a genocidal policy, right? So yeah, no, but that's an important point of clarification that I would give you that point for sure about the American Revolution. I would like to see the Washington transcripts.
Oh, by the way, there's a wonderful, I'm sorry, I'll briefly interrupt. I can't remember the name of the moment. I'm sure we could look it up, but it's called The Indian World of George Washington. It's by his very great Native Americanist historian of Native Americans. I can't remember his name, but the book is called The Indian World of George Washington. Colin, it just came to me. Sorry, Colin Calloway. Indian World of George Washington, and I think he touches on this. I mean, just something readily available to you, and then you can look at the bibliography or footage. He talks about the Knox Washington conversation, and all of Washington's papers are available Library of Congress Founders online, so you can look up all of that stuff in word searchable, etc. But I mean, But Eamon, I didn't want to. Did you have? Because I did want to come back on something if it was possible. Yeah. So, Tony, I guess what I wanted to put to you was, both in your video, and by the way, I really appreciated the fact in your video what you said about the way, the ideological purpose that Trump hysteria serves. Right, you have all of those leaders like Nancy Pelosi talking about our democracy, right, and the way in which the kind of Trump hysteria is ideologically organizing a defense of the status quo, right? Mm-hmm. Because at the very least, in the most common sense, I mean, just if you ask the everyday person, you know, how does representative democracy supposed to run, right? Well, people, right, either are happy with the way their society is being run or they're not. And if they're not, they throw the bums out, right? They unelect the previously elected officials, representatives, and they put new ones in who will do a better job governing in the common interest, the common affairs of society, right? And at the very least, Trump's election should have been, just in the everyday theory of representative democracy, liberal democracy, been a moment of, wait, okay, we're being sent here a signal by the population, which is discontent with the way the common affairs of society are being run, right? So what would be, you know, what we're just, I'm talking here in just everyday capitalist politics. I'm leaving Marxism aside, just everyday capitalist liberal democratic politics. The whole point would be, well, okay, our constituencies are trying to say something to us. And what kind of packages of policies or reforms do we have to, if we want to win back power, do we have to respond to and be you know, basically win back portions of the electorate? And I think exactly, you know, as you point out, a lot of that stuff was completely, that whole conversation was sidelined in this kind of anti-Trump hysteria. That is, instead of having a conversation about what might the liberal democratic order actually be trying to tell, right, the government about how the governed feel, right, or how the government feel things are going. Instead, it was, we have to defend our democracy from this huge specter of Trump. That being said, though, I do think there is a difference between us, which I would like to address, which is you both in your video and in this conversation, you use the word economic democracy, all of that. My issue with that, and it does to some degree go back to the American Revolution and the founding, but kind of bourgeois revolution more generally, is that I think that the founders, if I can use that term, were not Democrats, but rather they were liberals, right? In the classical sense.
I'd agree with that. Yeah.
Right. And so,
yeah, well, liberal democracy is a contradiction in terms historically, as you know, right? As you obviously know, is like liberalism emerges as an not in a democratic phenomenon in England, right? It's like an aristocratic movement.
I mean, it's a much later term, liberal democracy, right? Yeah. 20th century, but I'm just trying to mean by it a kind of a, you know, society that has everyday decisions made by democratic majorities, but fundamental individual rights, right? Civil rights, limiting the scope of those majorities, right? That's what I mean for the purpose of this conversation. So that's what I want to say is you use this word democracy, and so we agree. The founders and the American revolutionaries more broadly, and even the bourgeois revolutionaries even more broadly, are basically classical liberals, not Democrats. And the reason why I think that's an important point to make is when you talk about democracy, what you're really talking about is a share in power, meaning who gets to deter, like that is, people in the state have power. They control the coercive apparatus. They have power. And either they're permanent, they're hereditary, they're by divine right, or they're democratic, right? They're indirect democracy, representative democracy, or direct democracy, what have you, whatever shape or form. The point is, democracy is only really at the end of the day about a share of power. And what I would insist on, that, because I'm sorry, there's something I should have said before this. I apologize. You had said, Tony, to me, you talk in this way because you want to be able to speak to Americans. That's why you talk about the American Revolution in the way you do. And you said I'd
speak differently depending on who I'm talking to. Yes.
Right.
But yeah, what the videos is, the videos, yes, would be in that more way.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And what I want to make clear is that that is true. I do think obviously the legacy of the American Revolution is something that one needs to be able to speak with people about, and that's absolutely right. I don't deny that. But there is a broader point that I would make in the American Revolution, particularly the bourgeois revolutions more generally, right? They were classical liberals. They were interested in liberty, freedom. They were not interested in power, right? Democracy is ultimately about a share of power. I get to vote for the people who wield the power, who basically get to use that power coercively on others. What the bourgeois revolutionaries, the American revolutionaries, the people that are the kind of proto-liberals, if you will, what they want is to reduce power, to destroy the concentration of power, to reduce it so as to maximize freedom and liberty. And so the view of people like James Madison, James Wilson, the American revolutionaries more broadly, the bourgeois revolutionaries more broadly, the proto-liberals, if you will, right? Their view is you want to reduce power, to check it and balance it. You want to break it up, and you want to reduce it to a minimum because you want to maximize liberty and freedom. That's what people really should aim for, a share in liberty and freedom, not a share in power. Why do they have that view? They have that view because they think that where life is, where true liberty and freedom is in society, right? Deciding what you want to do with your life, who you want to work for, where you want to live, who you want to love, who you want to associate with, who you want to assemble with, who you want to organize, cooperate with, where you want to worship, what kind of entertainment you want to pursue. That it's really in society, in free cooperation with others, that freedom really exists, liberty and freedom really exists. And basically,
right, and we have to clarify, right, since we're all Marxist adjacent here, that this concept of civil society and like the private sphere is made possible by capitalist relations becoming the triumphant mode of production.
Yes.
Because like when we speak in that context, right, if we don't clarify that to people who don't know that, but might be obvious to us, that it can reify to regular people the bourgeois ideology, which Marx, of course, and probably more famously in any text than other texts, German ideology, vehemently criticizes things like the notions of the public interest, the national interest, and ways that kind of ideology is used to rationalize what our class domination. So like this is why I tend to make that distinction. But when we're talking with us, it'll be different to a wider populace. But I point that out, that why I said that concern. I said you risk reifying or risk legitimizing, where you risk reifying bourgeois ideology and risk legitimizing institutions, even though that's obviously not your intent. Insofar as if this was the rhetoric one was to use in reaching the masses, so to speak, that's kind of more what I'm trying to get at. Because right there, I feel like even in just what you were saying there about the freedoms and what the founders meant is like we cannot separate that from that class position and the what that's serving. I agree with you in that, like, of course they're not interested in democracy; they're interested in liberty, and those are very different things. And in democracy, as Aristotle famously, I think, best defines it, democracy taken to its conclusion is rule of the poor, and that's why he opposed it, right?
Yeah.
So,
but this is an important point. I understand what you're saying to me. What I'm trying to say to you, though, is that I think Marxists, right, have to take up the mantle of liberalism, not of democracy. And what I mean by that is simply that people like James Madison, people like James Wilson, the American revolutionaries more generally, and most general of all, the bourgeois revolutionaries, the proto-liberals, whatever you choose to call them, they believed that you should reduce power, force to an absolute minimum. And that basically everything should be up to the maximum extent possible by the free social cooperation of people, that people should determine the course of their own lives, and they should freely assemble, associate, cooperate with others to determine the course of their collective existence. And the amount of coercion, because coercion always means imposing uniformity, right? If you want actual pluralism, if you want people to pursue genuinely different ends of existence, a different course of their lives, to be able to live differently, right? But peaceably, you want to reduce coercion power as much as possible. Now, you're absolutely right, Tony. That was bound up with the development of what Marxists would call bourgeois social relations, right? Bourgeois social relations began to emerge in the 15th, 16th century, became totally dominant in the Western world by the late 18th century when this is happening. But they really believed, right, that ultimately over time, if you had an extremely limited government, right, meaning there was a limited amount of power, coercive capacity that could be controlled by anybody, whether it was a small elite oligarchy or a huge majority, right? If you reduce that, over time, you would have an expanding market, an extending division of labor, increasing employment, increasing wages, increasing property for all, and the increasing inclusion of everybody into the benefits of freedom of assembly, association, speech, discussion, debate in civil society. And so their real vision, Tony, was that the state would wither to a maximal degree, and people would just spontaneously, in a free society, set the conditions of their existence. And my view is that Marxists have to pick up that mantle and not the mantle of the state. And I'll conclude here. What I worry, and I'd like to hear your response to this, Tony, what I worry about your emphasis in democracy is whether you intend to or not. I do think you tend to ultimately bring the state or become statist. And what I mean by that is you can only imagine that freedom is people having a say in a gigantic centralized coercive apparatus, right? I.e. the vote, and or maybe even getting together with their iPhones, deciding maybe you don't even think there should be indirect democracy, representative democracy. There should be just direct democracy with our iPhones voting on everything. But that would still ultimately, Tony, I worry. What you're just doing, though, is your vision is ultimately statist, right? It's in my mind, it's a statist vision. And I think Marxists need to recover that liberal vision of the state fading to black and a free society having almost no coercion or power.
So those are very, very excellent questions. And I think there's some points of clarification in that video. The reason I use the word democracy because most Americans, most people who live in bourgeois society associate liberty and democracy as the same thing. And when speaking to people, like they assume these things go hand in hand. So I kind of speak in that way. But there's one point in the video, actually, surprised you didn't point this part out, is there was a part where I said socialism must, of course, be democratic with a specific socialist conception of liberty. With that emphasis there, I wouldn't go as far to say that the goal of socialism should take up the liberal aspect more than the democratic aspect. But I do think that liberal aspect is important insofar as there needs to be a socialist conception of liberty. But where I would maybe disagree with you, I actually think, I do think there needs to be a socialist conception of liberty, which is not statist. I don't think that is in Marxism, though. It's not at least very well developed. And that's why I don't think Leninism and Stalinism are huge stretches, as maybe classical Orthodox Marxists might think they are. Now, I don't use this to knock Marxism or oppose it, but I think in Marx's very conception of dictatorship of the proletariat is that of sharing power. And I think that is essential for practical reasons. That's why he emphasizes so much. And it's why, for practical reasons, I do kind of paint, which I think you accurately do characterize as a statist kind of position at the end of the day. Practical purposes, I think that will be essential for any major transitions. But I left that part about the socialist conception of liberty in there, not to give an answer, but I think that is something that should be looked at. And that's where I would agree that that aspect of how do we limit power, how from a socialist working class perspective, what does that actually look like? And I don't think that's immediately obvious, because I do think I do see a necessity, a necessary role of this transition. Of course, Marx emphasized the dictatorship of the proletariat for a very practical reason, and that's why he's not an anarchist. Because if one takes the idea of fully taking the mantle of liberalism as opposed to democracy, I think you end up in a kind of utopian type of politics that doesn't really see the inevitable role of the state in kind of making this transition. I mean, there's a reason why like liberal bourgeois democracy became increasingly statist over time, and that's because capitalism entered contradictions with working class struggles, and it wanted to stop communism globally. That's why they built the CIA and all of that. It's not, just a betrayal of it. It's facing those contradictions, and socialists will have to face contradictions with imperialist encirclement, with having to decide quick in times of emergency against potential backed militias against the revolutionary government. So I think there is like the status aspect, and I think you would be right to say that there is, if by looking at things solely in terms of power sharing, you do end up in a kind of statist way of envisioning a socialist transition. And I think that's true, but that's why I left the part about the socialist conception of liberty, because I think that is crucial. How do we actually limit the highly authoritarian potentials of the dictatorship of the proletariat? How do you prevent another Stalinism? I think those are all important questions. I don't have those answers, but I don't think those answers are immediately obvious, and that's kind of where I might disagree pretty hard with the Trotskyists. Is the Trotskyists, I think, don't have a very convincing explanation of Stalinism to me, yeah, I guess this is more or less what I have to say in response to that.
I would just say very quickly in response, I of course agree with you that there will be, insofar as we can speak about what the transition towards socialism under dictatorship proletariat would look like. Of course, there's going to be statist forms there at the beginning, and democracy is going to be a crucial element of that. I didn't mean to be completely dismissive of democracy, but it seems to me, insofar as we're thinking about the desideratum, like what the goal will be at the end, right, will be such that there will not be a necessity for any kind of coercion or power state that one has to democratize, that will fade away, and therefore the need for democracy, that is making power accountable to the people over which it's operated, will also fade away. So I think that there's more agreement here than at first meets the eye. I think that democracy will be an important element, radical democracy of the dictatorship proletariat. But I think that is not the end. That is simply the means to setting up a process where we confront the problems of capitalism for the first time in a politically self-conscious way, and with the goal of over time reducing the power and the coercive apparatus and the need for democracy, for there need to be accountability for anything to be held to account, right? I'm going to lose the wonderful line Engels has, right? We'll switch from the
administration of things.
Yes, from the
administration of people to administration of things.
Yeah,
I forget the line too, but
the rule of men to the administration of things, something like that. Exactly. We'll just be administering things. No, I agree with that. What I was worried about with the emphasis on democracy was that whether you intend to or not, I think that, I'm sorry for using this kind of language, is very Stalinist of me. I think that you objectively, in ways you might not be aware, will reinforce a kind of progressive or Democrat Party narrative tendency, which is precisely right, that the state is what ultimately is the goal, that the goal is not the transformation of capitalism to socialism, but rather the kind of more progressive capitalist state management of society.
Right.
And the reason why I have this fear, Tony, has nothing to do with you because we've just met for the first time. But I meet a lot of people younger than me who had been very involved in the Sanders and Corbyn movements. And the Corbyn left-wing leader of the Labor Party and Bernie Sanders.
Of course.
You know that, but just for the audience purpose. And it's sort of like the Corbynistas in the UK. Their vision of socialism was essentially, as far as I could tell, just radically democratizing the capitalist state, meaning, of course, expanding the welfare state, expanding Keynesian stimulus, all of that, but then massively democratizing the capitalist state. And the vision they seem to have, and honestly, it's embodied in somebody like Jeremy Corbyn. It really is what I'm about to say, meaning that life would just be meetings all the time, right? Like that is Jeremy Corbyn. That is people like Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders' entire lives, right? They just go to meetings and vote on things all the time. That's
that seems more like an anarchist position than a radical social democrat position.
That was the Corbyn position. The Corbyn position really was a radical democratization. I mean, he's a Bennite, rooted in the politics of Tony Benn. And all these people do all day is go to meetings and give speeches and take votes. I mean, the votes don't have much consequence because they don't have any power. But that's their vision of what like a democratized, what a socialist society would look like, is just like constant meetings and voting. To me, that seems dystopian, right?
Yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah,
This is where sometimes I'm at. Well, this is why I was, when you were talking about the abolition of the state, this is actually a side of Marxism I think is very understudied in the field of Marxism, because it's not all clear to me how that's appealing. I mean, it seems appealing on the face of it, but I tend to be actually more Hegelian than Marxist in certain respects, in the sense that I think the state guarantees a lot of freedoms. So this is one thing I disagree with the likes of Lenin when he says there can't be freedom as long as there's a state. I always thought that well, I didn't always think that, but I think that now that that's kind of is used as an easy excuse to kind of like not look at the democracy question. And I think these are, what's important in that is what I mean by economic democracy, and why I emphasize that so much in the video, is what one could call this economic liberty. And I think that has to do with non-exploitative modes of organizing and social relations that are beyond capitalism, which exist in, I guess, what we today call civil society. That's kind of what I mean by an economic democracy. And I think I would be in support of those kind of some of those Corbyn policies, which would facilitate the creation of worker cooperatives, because while that isn't socialism itself, I think that builds relations which get us closer to that. And what is making that possible? The state helps make that possible by making credit unions possible, by cracking down on the wills of banks who are diametrically opposed to those interests. So what I kind of am saying here is that I don't, with the status, what it might look like status, I think there's an inevitable role of the state in preserving that economic democracy, which one could alternatively call economic liberty, because I'm not an anarchist. I'm not a radical Democrat. I don't believe in even direct democracy beyond a local level. I don't think it's even possible in mass society or desirable. It's not even clear to me, even though that sortition is ideal. I think there could be a case for it, but I'm not. What I mean is maybe because I say I specialize in Wolin, what I meant by I don't agree with all his views, I'm not a radical Democrat like Sheldon Wolin is. And precisely because I think you'll need a kind of powerful state for a long period to facilitate those conditions in which socialism, which is more about the relations of people, to develop. And I know that is contradiction in a way a lot of Marxists typically look at it, because they view democracy as a question, like democracy won't exist, right? When during communism, democracy isn't a question because democracy is a form of state. And I can see where your criticisms of democracy being too emphasized on power sharing being, but what I mean by a democracy is sort of democratization of social relations and the decommodification of those relations. But that will require a change in that apparatus, which I think guarantees certain freedoms and creates new freedoms, which is the state. So, like you could call it status, I think might be fair characterization, but I think we can't just brush away these questions because how are socialists, well, there's no really socialist social relations technically, but communist social relations, post-capitalist economy, whatever one wants to call it. How is that going to actually materialize without a state that operates in the will of the exploited classes. And that's where I think the democracy question is pretty crucial.
I guess, Tony, what I would say in response to that, and Eamon, you might, I don't want to take us too far off topic what you want to tend to talk about tonight, but I would just say briefly that if you had, I'm not saying, Tony, you share a complete Corbyn vision, but obviously you have some sympathies. If you had an incredibly democratized capitalist state, widespread workers' cooperatives, credit unions in society, I still think you would face the imperative of capital accumulation. And therefore, I think that would, I mean, first off, if this is taking
That's fair.
within one country, meaning if this is happening within one country, there's obviously going to be the international system and international competition between labor markets and economic units. But also there's going to be the need to have capital accumulation. And that means ultimately, at the end of the day, however democratized the capitalist state is, however allied to credit unions, workers' cooperatives, and society, those things are going to have to become the means for the ends of capital accumulation, i.e., they're still the capitalist state. It's still capitalism.
No, that's all fair. That's all fair. That's where I might agree with my fellow Trots, about the you can't really have socialism in one country. But yeah, no, those are all fair points. I just see those as transitionary policies, not socialism itself.
The Stalinism point, if Trotsky and the left opposition had won for some reason in the early revolution, you would still end up with undemocratic, pretty top-down system in the USSR, just because the conditions weren't possible to have really anything else, especially after the Civil War and the 14 imperialist powers invading. So material conditions dictated Stalinism. I was going to ask James about whether, from his perspective, conservative historians depict a more accurate narrative than progressive historians and some of the Marxists, but you kind of already answered that.
I would say neither and both, meaning I think there are moments of truth in both. Could I respond to that very quickly?
Yeah.
I think the progressives, I'll give you an example. Woodrow Wilson, right, who was both a progressive historian and a progressive politician, meaning he was a professional historian and a president of the United States. He very much had the view that the problem with the constitutional order is that it was founded in a largely agrarian republic, and it had been essentially made irrelevant by the urbanization, industrialization of the country. Now, I think there's a moment of truth in that. That is to say that when the constitutional order was being put in place, right, the U.S. was part of kind of global bourgeois society. It was itself a bourgeois society, right? Overwhelmingly agricultural, degrees of commerce and manufacturing, but overwhelmingly a bourgeois society. And what happened with the full development of the capitalist mode of production, what Marx calls the age of machine industry, what we would call industrialization, is essentially that society enters into contradiction and crisis with itself. That labor, which is our only means of accessing the riches and the potentials of bourgeois society, is rendered increasingly dispensable by capitalism, or rather, I should say, the laborer who labors is rendered increasingly dispensable by capitalism. Anyway, that introduces a number of pathologies. But the point I'm trying to say here is this, that I do think the progressives have a moment of truth, meaning people like Woodrow Wilson grasp that there's been some profound change over the course of the 19th century that makes us have to deal with the constitutional order. Now, they move on from there from saying we're going to create this fourth branch of government, the administrative order, full of expert professors and technocrats who will manage society in its own interests, right? On the other hand, the conservatives, right, and then the progressives, in order to defend their view of the technocratic management of society, they make a complete travesty of American revolutionary constitutional history, meaning because they're basically suspending the constitutional order with this fourth branch of government, they create an incredibly vulgar ideological count of history, which makes a travesty of the American Revolution and the federal constitution, which is that it's, basically, at the end of the day, the victory of a very tiny propertied minority against the democratic aspirations of the vast majority of society. Now, on the other hand, I think the conservatives are right in the sense that they have a better understanding of the constitutional, or they have a good understanding of what the progressives have done, that the progressives have suspended the constitutional order and basically rule unconstitutionally, and have made a travesty of American revolutionary and constitutional history as part of their project to rule unconstitutionally. But I think the conservatives are just incredibly wrong, indeed naive with regard to what happened in the 19th century. That in fact, capitalism developed, industrial capitalism developed, society was proletarianized, right? Not simply in Wilson's terms, urbanized, industrialized, but proletarianized. Laborers, people who have lived through offering their labor for a wage, were rendered utterly dispensable, and their only access to the richness of bourgeois society what is their labor, and their labor was rendered increasingly utterly dispensable and surplus to requirements, and all of the pathologies that follow through that from that. Now that's what I mean. I basically say I think the conservatives have a better grasp of the actual history to an important degree. I mean, there's problems with it, to be sure, but they have a better grasp of the actual history. But progressives have a better grasp of the fact that the subsequent developments, the industrialization, the urbanization, the proletarianization, that rendered the constitutional order incapable of dealing with essentially the development of society.
Would you consider Gordon Wood a conservative or progressive historian?
So I would consider him. So that's a difficult question, Tony. I guess I would consider him broadly put a conservative historian. But what I mean by that, I have no idea how he votes or who he supports or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean more in the sense you're using it, like in terms of his reading of the American Revolution.
Yeah, I think in academic life, he's treated as a conservative, which is meant that he doesn't take on board the original progressive historiography of the early 20th century, or the neo-progressive new left race, sex, gender, identity politics movement historiography of more recent decades. He definitely,
the 1619 project, he's also critical of that.
Yeah, he's one of those that the World Socialist website did a great service in organizing him. Whatever you think of the Northites, they did a great service in organizing Gordon Wood and James McPherson and others together to respond to that. So I do think he's a conservative. I don't know what his political self-understanding is, but I think in academic terms, he's a conservative, which makes him such a good historian, meaning he basically is concerned to try and understand the American Revolution and the Constitution without the presentist lens of, current identity politics and social justice concerns.
This is a question I had about, because you mentioned the conservative and progressive historians. You, in the talk you had with Eamon, you kind of lumped a lot of neo-Marxists with progressives. Now, I'm curious if you'd consider the following authors neo-Marxists of the progressive sort, because I kind of think, so there's a set of thinkers who have sort of informed my perspective on this, which, I mean, come from different lenses, but often are Marxist adjacent lenses. But the likes of a good example is Ellen Meekson's Wood, who actually taught at the university that I went to, York University. And she's no longer alive, but she's a very famous scholar. Of course, she has the book Democracy Against Capitalism, which has a very interesting chapter on the American Revolution, we the people, and framers of the U.S. Constitution, and the project of liberalism as a whole. I don't really need to go into explaining what she says because I don't want to oversimplify it, but I'm guessing, James, you're already familiar with her, because given she's like Marxist person who's written a lot of historical literature on political theory and the historical materialist analysis of the history of ideas too. And Mike Davis is another thinker who Prisoners of the American Dream is a book that also has shaped the way I kind of understand American history. They're both Marxist adjacent. In the case, I don't know, like where if you would situate them, like would you situate them I see them personally as independently really from this conservative progressive binary, but I know because you lumped a lot of neo-Marxists into progressive historians. I'm guessing maybe like Eric Williams, you might consider like that's what came to my mind when you talked about neo-Marxists being progressivists. What would you think of these thinkers if you have an opinion on them?
I should say that very quickly. When I was lumping a lot of 20th century Marxist figures into the progressive historical school, what I meant is a long time ago, I sort of just took it upon myself to read through what a lot of parties and sects and 20th century US had said about the American Revolution. It's pretty clear that more or less from the FDR era, the Popular Front era, the Popular Front Against Fascism era, FDR, Stalin, etc., there had essentially a lot of communist and Marxist organizations had taken on board the progressive narrative of the American Revolution, that, oh, there was this earlier phase that was from below and democratic, and there was this later phase ultimately victorious with the federal constitution that was from the top down and counter-revolutionary.
So like Charles Beard, basically, right?
Yes. Okay, now Marxists did not believe that. That is, if you look at, by and large, of course, there's always, I'm making broad generalizations here, but basically, if you follow I'm not talking about professional historiography, but what Marxists wrote and said, roughly from Marx and Engels through to about the 1920s, there was a very distinct Marxist narrative from the progressive narrative, right? But then what I think happened is that more or less since the 20s and more especially the 30s and 40s, Marxists began to basically take on the progressive narrative, not really in a sense of self-consciously. They don't write something saying, we now take on the progressive narrative. They just kind of spontaneously articulate it as part of the politics of what's going on in the era of fascism, war, FDR, Stalin, etc. And I think that stuff gets baked into the cake, such that today there are many people who identify as Marxists. I mean, who am I to decide he's a Marxist, she's not a Marxist, whatever. But who have that narrative, but I think it's essentially the progressive narrative. It's not the classical Marxist narrative that, say, an Engels and a Kautsky and a Trotsky would have that. Whatever the difference is between Engels and Kautsky and Trotsky, I think they all would have shared a basic vision of the American Revolutionary experience, as I've tried to poorly reiterate it. But I think most Marxists today follow the progressive tradition. Now, the two thinkers you mentioned, I should say this. I know Ellen Wood's work. I mean, Ellen Wood was obviously a major political scientist, right? And that there were many Marxists at that University of York, not just Wood, but many, right? I'm forgetting the others who were there, but
David McNally, a lot of them, yeah.
Right, that was Leo Panitch, I think, too.
Yeah,
right?
Leo Panitch.
That was a major center of Marxist intellectual life, and obviously these people contributed a great deal. I'm not seeking to deny that. Ellen Wood, I've never read her Democracy Against Capitalism. I've read her Origins of Capitalism, and she has a bunch of stuff on kind of the French Revolution and considering political theory in light of developments. What I would say, Tony, is that she kind of became a kind of Robert Brenner on steroids, if you would, meaning that she took
weird.
Sorry,
she critiques him hard.
Really?
That's interesting. Yeah.
You have to explain that more to me, but she seems to me that
yeah, it's in the Democracy and Capitalism book, actually, like in the part on teleology.
Oh, okay. I'm not familiar with that, but you'll have to explain. But what I'll say very quickly, what I mean is Robert Brenner developed certain historical theses about the origins of capitalism in Western Europe and why capitalism really emerges first and most thoroughly in the English countryside. And this is why ultimately Great Britain has the first industrial revolution. I mean, we need not get into whether or not that perspective is right or wrong, but she, it seems to me, took that view and then expanded it into this body of work called political Marxism, which Robert Brenner more or less signed on to. I'm not saying he didn't play a role in it, but she expanded in this body of work called political Marxism, where she ended up saying capitalism is these very specific set of social property relations. And if these set of social property relations don't exist, you don't have capitalism. And I actually thought that that was far too straight-jacketed an approach to history, meaning I think that the emergence of bourgeois society is much more multivarious and fluid than that kind of approach that says you have to have these very specific social property relations that force market dependency and capital accumulation. And
her thing is more or less like you need a state that kind of enforces a socio-legal order that recreates those economic compulsions that make capitalism happen. So that's why she thinks like you don't really truly get capitalism till Britain.
Yeah. So and this is going to make a really long story short. You'll come back if I'm not clear. I think she conflates dynamics that only come into play really in the 19th century. Meaning, I think that she basically thinks that bourgeois society is the end of bourgeois society is the ceaseless accumulation of capital. I think that's the end of capitalism, meaning when the capitalist mode of production, what Marx and Engels call the capitalist mode of production, what we would call capitalism, fully develops after the Industrial Revolution, it does have a compulsion to accumulate capital, and that is ceaseless, and that is its main dynamic. I don't deny that. But I think she back projects that into the history of the emergence of bourgeois society going all the way back to the Renaissance. And I actually think in bourgeois society, that kind of compulsion to accumulate capital did not exist. Rather, I would emphasize the development of free labor and people being able to set the course of their own lives and make their own decisions that allowed them to important degrees work harder and smarter and become more self-determining. Now, they set up a system, a whole machinery, a social and economic machinery of cooperation, which ended up becoming incredibly transformative of the world, meaning it wasn't simply that they were free laborers as they existed when they emerged as free laborers in the Middle Ages, but a free laborer in the 18th century is able in an hour of labor time to basically have much more product, to be much more productive, to transform much more of the world than a free laborer in the late Middle Ages. That's because this entire machinery of social and economic cooperation has been set up. Marx talks about this as the kind of cooperation and manufacturing phases of the capitalist mode of production. And this machinery is incredibly productive. But I don't think, this machinery is in crisis and contradiction until the 19th century, what Marx calls the rise of the age of machine industry. And that's because that highly productive machinery up until the Industrial Revolution had essentially been based on continuing inputs. Had been essentially based on the fact that human labor had become cooperative and in cooperating with one another had been able to much more successfully transform the world together than they could on their own. But they became so successful that they gave rise to machines. They gave rise to a kind of self-transforming nature through science, machinery, etc. And that proletarianized society, that made workers, the laborers themselves, increasingly dispensable and in competition with one another. And that set up a dynamic of ceaseless capital accumulation. Anyway, I'm going off the deep end here, but I guess my answer to you, Tony, is I think she back projects what only becomes true in the 19th century, that the capitalism has a compulsion towards the ceaseless expansion of capital. That doesn't exist with rising bourgeois society, right? Now, rising bourgeois society gives rise to the Industrial Revolution, and in that sense gives rise to the compulsion to ceaselessly accumulate capital, right? To basically, instead of use dead labor to enrich living labor, you use living labor simply to accumulate dead labor ever more and more and more. I'm sorry, it's a bit late for me and I'm going off the deep end here and being a bit crude. But what I mean to say essentially is that my problem with Ellen Wood is that I think that she's very reductionist in her treatment of bourgeois society.
So she's treating all.
I like to see.
Sorry, she's treating all phases of capitalism as the same.
Yes, she's treating, in my estimation, and what I've read about her on the origin of capitalism, the French Revolution, she's talking about the 16th, 17th, 18th century. She talks about a kind of market dependency rooted in social property relations. And she sees that as basically driving a compulsion to accumulate capital. And I think she thinks that's a problem from the beginning, meaning I think she thinks that the problems of capitalism are there from the beginning. Whereas I think that compulsion to accumulate capital only really becomes self-contradictory with the full development of machine industry with the Industrial Revolution, if that makes sense.
The way I understood it is that is something she says though, is that it's part of why she doesn't think capitalism is fully formed till the Industrial Revolution in England. But I'd be curious about the arguments regarding living labor and dead labor. Do you have any like articles or books which like kind of advance that perspective? Which like I'd be curious to pick those up, read those.
Ultimately, I mean, I'm not trying to be facetious here, but ultimately it would be Marx's Capital Volume 1, right? But I think an excellent entree into Marx's Capital Volume 1. I mean, there's nothing that can replace reading Marx's Capital Volume 1, but I think a very good entree into it or initial guide to it is a work of Marxology by a recently deceased expert of Marx named Moishe Postone. He wrote a book called Time, Labor, and Social Domination, right? And what I think his book is excellent at doing, right, is getting at the fact that capitalist society is a form of self-domination of working people. That is, working people through their everyday structured practices constitute capitalist social relations, which dominate them in turn, right? That is, whereas I think many Marxists fall into the trap of reducing capitalism to capitalists, to simply an imposition of capitalists on everybody else. I think Postone is excellent at helping you to see the way that what Marx is talking about in Capital Volume 1 is self-constituted or self-generated domination, that the workers themselves, through their structured collective practices, are actually constituting capitalism and constituting a form of social domination over themselves.
Interesting.
Yeah. I mean,
sounds like a structural what people today call like the structural Marxist type of perspectives seen in Poulantzas and Althusser, kind of.
I mean, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's really it. But I saw Richard Wolff employ that kind of understanding of capitalism in his analysis of the USSR. Like, he has an old paper he wrote many, many years ago about why the USSR has capitalist social relations. And I never really believed the idea that USSR was capitalist. Not that it's like, that doesn't make it socialist either, but it's that was the most convincing case to me. It's like because he had a completely different understanding of capitalism that is more structuralist kind of.
But that theme about the way that with the fully developed capitalist mode of production, living labor and dead labor, or let's call it wage labor. By living labor, I'm just going to use another term, wage labor or free labor, and dead labor or, accumulated labor, capital. They enter into essentially contradiction with one another. Now, I think that is only fully adequately worked out in Capital Volume 1, but that theme goes all the way back to Marx's writings, quite youthful writings in the 1840s. You can even say it in the Communist Manifesto. I mean, they say in the Communist Manifesto, they famously define bourgeois society as effectively the society in which the past dominates the present. I can't remember the exact line, but it's effectively, they say, in bourgeois society, the past dominates the present. In socialist society or in communism, the present will dominate the past, right? And they also point out in that exact same section of the Communist Manifesto, it's called Proletarians and Communists. I can't remember exactly. They point out that that in capitalism, right, that effectively living labor is simply a means to augment dead labor, to augment capital, whereas the goal of communism would be to take capital, dead labor, accumulated labor, I mean the past, the entire way in which we previously transformed the world, and put it at the use of us, the living, right? I mean, he's already trying to point out, they, Marx and Engels, are already trying to point out as early as the Communist Manifesto, although I don't think they fully work it out to Capital Volume 1, that the key problem with the capitalist mode of production is we have capital, we have accumulated labor, we have dead labor, we have the ways in which our prior cooperation has radically transformed the world and accumulated over time. And we should be able to make that the basis of our existence in the here and now. But instead, what we do is we make living labor serve the augmentation in a very narrow, strict sense of capital, that dead labor of the past. So it's already in the manifesto where they're defining what communism would be and what capitalism is in these terms. I mean, they're defining capitalism as living labor existing solely to augment dead labor, and they define communism as us being able to take control or socialize dead labor and capital and to put it at the work of the living, right? If that makes sense.
I think we can wrap it up. We've been going almost 2.5 hours, I think. The other questions I have, we kind of bulldozed over those anyway. Maybe just some quick closing remarks from both of you, and let the audience know where to find your content, your work, and then we'll say goodbye.
Sure. Yeah, I was not actually familiar with James Vaughn until the talk you did. I've seen you pop up on Diet Soap Sublation Media podcast before, so I'll definitely check those out. And if you have any like works you'd recommend, I'd definitely check them out to see more of your perspective. But no, this was a great discussion. I think these are important discussions, especially I think regarding the extension of a socialist conception of liberty. That is an interest of mine. I don't know many thinkers who really address that concretely, other than there's people like Eric Olin Wright, who looks at like ways of the practical questions. It's like the old question, what does socialism look like? What do socialist structures look like? I think these are important questions, because without that exploration, we will inevitably end up with a statist conception of socialism, because how do we know the alternative? I'm skeptical of statist politics, and that's part of why I wrote that article on the Cultural Revolution, is because I interpret the Cultural Revolution as an anti-statist politics, looking at it as a kind of as opposed to the conventional totalitarian narrative of it, and that's part of what makes it all terrifying. But I guess that's something I'd plug, is on my channel One Dime. My most recent documentary is on the Chinese Cultural Revolution. It's called The Cultural Revolution: The Full Story. If anybody wants to check a video out, I'd recommend that one.
Thank you, Tony, for having this conversation. And again, well, thank you again, Tony, for having this conversation. And thanks again, Eamon, for hosting it. I would just say, if you're interested in, because this has been broadly about the American Revolution, the Constitution, I have some videos you can find online. I did a previous conversation with Eamon, and I have some videos that I've done, as Tony said, with Diet Soap, Sublation Media, and with Platypus. You can just in YouTube type James Vaughn, the American Revolution, come across them there. If you're a listening person, if you're more inclined to reading, you can just type into Google James Vaughn 1776 in World History, and that's an essay basically on thinking about the American Revolution in a broader perspective of the bourgeois revolution in world history. That's in the Platypus Review from 10 or 12 years ago. My God, I think it may be longer than that. I'm not certain. And a more recent essay from a few years ago called The Revolution for Society, which you can find online as well. That was in an edited collection called People Power. But that being said, I've really enjoyed this conversation. And I actually, Tony, Eamon was telling me you have a Cultural Revolution video, because I thought your separation powers video had a high quality of production. Obviously, we have some disagreements about the separation of powers, but I enjoyed watching it. And so I'm going to look forward to watching your Cultural Revolution video. And I also hope you make that. I confess that I did forget that line you talked about, socialist conception of liberty. So I hope you make a video on it. That would be great.
Yeah, no, thanks for hosting this, Eamon Swoletariat.
Oh, you're welcome, guys, and thanks for coming. And despite all the last minute changes, ended up working out. Great conversation. With that, we will close out.